Chelsea opened their 2026-27 Premier League campaign with a 3-2 victory over Fulham, but this was more than just a 5-goal opening day game. Behind Chelsea's 3 goals was a very clear tactical idea: how to control Fulham without necessarily dominating possession, and how to create attacking opportunities through rotations and positional movement. Chelsea were particularly interesting in 2 moments. Without the ball, they defended in a 5-2-3, using man-oriented pressing to disrupt Fulham's build-up, and once they had possession, they frequently moved into a 3-1 structure, allowing their players to rotate, push higher up the pitch, and attack the spaces between Fulham's defensive lines. So how exactly did Chelsea use these 2 structures to win the game? Let's break it down. Let's start with Chelsea without the ball. When Fulham tried to build from the back, Chelsea would often settle into a 5-2-3 defensive structure. Fulham's initial shape was closer to a 4-2-3-1, but their goalkeeper could become an additional player during the build-up. Chelsea's response was very clear. They wanted to protect the central areas and force Fulham towards the wings. The front 3 were extremely important here. Rather than simply running towards the ball, Chelsea's forwards used their positioning to block passing lanes. For example, João Pedro could press the ball while using his cover shadow to block access to one of Fulham's center-backs. At the same time, Cole Palmer and Morgan Rogers were positioned to cover Fulham's double pivot. This created a difficult situation for Fulham. The goalkeeper could not easily play through the center. The midfielders were being monitored, and the defenders were often being followed closely by Chelsea's defensive line. So Fulham were gradually being pushed towards one side, and once the ball went there, Chelsea would shift across aggressively. This is an important detail. Chelsea were not simply trying to win the ball immediately. They were trying to control where Fulham could play, and this is exactly where the first goal came from. Fulham's goalkeeper has possession. João Pedro begins his press, but instead of simply attacking the goalkeeper, he uses his cover shadow to block one of the center backs. That leaves the other center back as the obvious passing option. The goalkeeper plays the ball to him, and immediately Chelsea shift towards that side. Now look at what has happened. The center back has very few safe short options. The central passing lanes are blocked. Chelsea are close to the receiving players, and Fulham are being forced backwards or towards a long ball. Eventually, the center back goes long. Chelsea win the second ball, play forward quickly, and just 2 passes later, they score. So when we look at the goal, we shouldn't only look at the final pass or the finish. The goal actually starts several seconds earlier. Chelsea's pressing structure created the conditions for Fulham to make that decision. This is what makes the 5-2-3 so effective. It doesn't necessarily have to win the ball in the first action. Sometimes the objective is simply to remove the opponent's best options until the long ball becomes the only realistic solution. But Chelsea didn't use the 5-2-3 only when pressing high. The same structure remained when they dropped into a mid or low block. And here, another important principle became visible. Chelsea wanted to create a 3-player overload around the side of the pitch where the ball was located. For example, if Fulham had possession on one side, Chelsea could have the wingback, one of the central midfielders, and the winger working very close together. In this example, you can see Malo Gusto, Reece James, and Cole Palmer operating around the ball. The idea is simple. Instead of defending the entire width of the pitch equally, Chelsea would concentrate players around the ball and make it difficult for Fulham to progress. Then, if Fulham switched the ball to the opposite side, Chelsea had to repeat the same movement. The opposite wingback had to move across, the nearest midfielder had to shift, and the winger had to recover. But this is also where Chelsea's system showed one of its weaknesses, because this was a very man-oriented structure. Timing was extremely important. If one player arrived late, the entire chain could become vulnerable, and Fulham's goal is a good example. Chelsea failed to shift across quickly enough. Romeo Lavia was slightly late getting across, and Morgan Rogers could be seen communicating with him, asking him to cover the space behind. That small delay created an opening. Fulham were able to exploit the space and eventually score. There was also an issue with Chelsea's goalkeeper and his positioning in the sequence. So although Chelsea's defensive structure was clear, it was not perfect. And that tells us something important about this system. The structure itself can be excellent, but it only works if every player moves at the right moment. This is where Chelsea became particularly interesting. Once they progressed beyond the initial build-up, they frequently moved into a 3-1 structure, and this structure gave them a very different set of possibilities. It allowed Chelsea to push more players forward while still maintaining a defensive structure behind the ball. But the most important element was not simply the shape, it was the rotations inside that shape. Chelsea were constantly changing positions. At times, you could even see one of the center backs moving extremely high, almost behaving like a full-back. So how did Chelsea create this? One of the 2 central midfielders could drop into the defensive line. That creates a new back 3. But because Chelsea already had had 3 defenders, one of the original center backs was now free to move higher. The wingbacks could stay wide and stretch Fulham's defensive line, and this created space in the half spaces for players such as Cole Palmer and Morgan Rogers. This is the key idea. Chelsea were not just moving players forward, they were moving players forward while constantly replacing the spaces they left behind. And the second goal is probably the best example of this. Let's slow this sequence down. Reece James moves inside and occupies the space between Chelsea's center backs. Romeo Lavia remains around the pivot zone. The wingbacks stay wide, giving Chelsea maximum width. Fulham now have a difficult decision. If their players stay narrow, Chelsea can use the width. If they move towards the wingbacks, they create space inside. This is exactly the type of positional dilemma Chelsea wanted to create. Now Maxence Lacroix has the ball. He plays it out to Malo Gusto, but look carefully at Lacroix. He doesn't stop after making the pass. He continues his movement towards the half space, and at the same time, Romeo Lavia moves into the space that Lacroix has vacated. This is the rotation. One player moves forward. Another player fills the space behind him. The structure remains balanced. Gusto then finds Cole Palmer, and Lacroix is still continuing his run. Palmer recognizes it. He plays the pass into Lacroix's path. Suddenly, a center back has arrived in an advanced position around the edge of the box. Lacroix delivers the ball across goal, and Morgan Rogers finishes it. A beautiful example of how Chelsea's rotations can create unexpected attacking situations. But there is something even more important here. The goal wasn't created simply because Lacroix made a good run. The run worked because the rest of the structure created the space for it. Lavia replaced Lacroix. Gusto provided the initial width. Palmer occupied the inside channel, and Rogers attacked the final space. Everything was connected. So what exactly did Chelsea gain from this 3-1 structure? There are 2 major advantages. First, more players can attack. Because one midfielder can drop into the defensive line, Chelsea can release another player forward. That means they can have more bodies between Fulham's defensive and midfield lines. Second, it creates constant positional dilemmas. Fulham cannot simply follow one player, because as soon as they follow him, another player can move into the space he has created. This is why the rotations were so important. Chelsea were constantly asking Fulham, who follows the movement? And more importantly, what happens to the space that player leaves behind? This is where Cole Palmer became particularly valuable, because when the structure around him changes, Palmer can find pockets between the lines. Morgan Rogers benefits from the same movements on the opposite side, and the wingbacks provide the width that prevents Fulham from simply collapsing into the center. However, there is always a trade-off. The more players you send forward and the more aggressively you rotate, the more important your rest defense becomes. If the rotations are not synchronized, Chelsea can become exposed, and we saw similar problems when they were defending. Their man-oriented defensive structure meant that a late movement from one player could create a gap for Fulham. So Chelsea's system has a very clear strength. It creates intensity, movement, and unpredictability, but it also has a clear weakness. It demands extremely good coordination. One player being late can create a problem. One player abandoning his zone at the wrong time can open a passing lane, and one poorly timed rotation can leave the team vulnerable to a counterattack. So what can we actually take from Chelsea's 3-2 victory? The most interesting thing is that their attacking and defensive structures were connected. Without the ball, Chelsea used the 5-2-3 to control Fulham's build-up. They protected the center, forced Fulham wide, and used aggressive shifts around the ball. With the ball, Chelsea moved into a 3-1 structure, using rotations to create space and move more players into advanced positions. These 2 ideas gave Chelsea control in 2 completely different moments of the game. When Fulham had the ball, Chelsea wanted to control where they could play. When Chelsea had the ball, they wanted to control where their own players could appear. And that's perhaps the most interesting tactical feature of this game. Chelsea weren't simply relying on individual quality. They were creating situations where their players could receive the ball in advantageous positions. So, was Chelsea's 3-2 victory simply a chaotic opening day win? I don't think so. There was a clear tactical identity behind it. The 5-2-3 gave Chelsea a pressing and defensive structure that could disrupt Fulham's build-up. The 3-1 structure gave them the flexibility to attack with more players, and the rotations between the center backs, midfielders, wingbacks, and attacking players created the space that eventually produced some of their best attacking moments. But at the same time, the game showed that Chelsea still have things to improve. Their man-oriented defensive structure can become vulnerable if the shifts are late. Their attacking rotations require excellent timing, and their aggressive positioning can leave spaces if possession is lost at the wrong moment. But if these movements become more consistent, Chelsea could be a very interesting team to watch this season, because the most important thing we saw against Fulham wasn't just 3 goals. It was an idea, a team that wants to control the opponent without the ball and create chaos for the opponent with it. And that is how Chelsea began their 2026/27 Premier League campaign with a 3-2 victory over Fulham.